I would very much like to welcome Mike Watts, who a lot of you I'm sure already know and are familiar with. And Mike has worked for GROW for 30 years as a field worker and then the National Programme Co-ordinator. He was a service user member of the first Mental Health Commission and has written widely on his recent PhD study, which involved a narrative study of 26 long-term members of GROW in Ireland. And the main emerging theme was that given the right resources, recovery can be experienced as re-enhancement with life and not as a lifelong illness. So Mike is going to speak for around 35 minutes, and then I'll hand over to Dr. Louise Doyle, who will conduct a question and answer session, and we'll finish between 6 and 6:15. So I'd like you just to give a warm round of applause to welcome Mike Watts, please.
Well, thanks very much. It's a real honour, and I think it's a lovely idea to have a public lecture series, and it's a real honour to have been asked by the School of Nursing and Midwifery to talk about peer support in mental health recovery. It's something that's been a part of my life for the last getting on for 40 years. Perhaps before I start, I should stress that this presentation is almost exactly like the one that I gave at the conference on January the 9th, so if anyone wants to go, they won't upset me. What I want to do is try and convey to you the significance and promise of an exciting new research story which depicts recovery from mental illness, not as a form of chemical imbalance, but as a re-enchantment with life. A re-enchantment initiated and nurtured very much through peer support or mutual help. To me, the findings of this research represent a real paradigm shift in the way we understand mental illness, recovery, and perhaps in the way we should organise or reorganise our mental health services. Peer support or mutual help is the natural condition of human beings. All religions and secular philosophies, such as communism and humanism, seem to agree that we're essentially interdependent and very much the same. In 1965, Reisman defined the term helper principle, and he said that it's far more therapeutic to give help than to receive it. And key to all forms of peer support is that you have the opportunity to both give and receive help. One of the problems with our current mental health system is that it doesn't acknowledge the value of the experience of mental illness, and therefore there's no role for those people who become mentally ill. Astonishingly clever, though we humans have become, none of us knows the answers to all the basic questions such as what's life, what is a human being, what is mental illness. Life remains a mystery, and to each one of us has unique insights, some of which are helpful to recovery, some aren't. We're like skydivers hurtling through time and space with only an appearance of being in control. And to reassure each other, we hold hands with people who think that like we do. Philosophers like Kant and Bruner agree we have two ways of trying to know anything, and they call them scientific inquiry and experience. Within our mental health system, experience has been routinely ignored as a source of knowledge, and scientific inquiry has been given authority. In 2006, the Irish government adopted recommendations of a vision for change, aspiring to transform our mental health system from one which views mental illness through a scientifically derived biomedical lens to one rooted in a radically different recovery view, one that's been constructed from the experience of people who've recovered. The difficulties in this aspiration are vast and shouldn't be underestimated, and I think the biggest one is that the system is totally overloaded. So however good a mental health professional is, they haven't the resources to give the time to each person that comes to them. As well as the legally underpinned authority that's given to the medical view, there's the vast influence of the pharmaceutical industry and a consumer mindset that increasingly seeks for instant solutions. There's a range of family, financial, political and academic issues between a whole array of people and a media-fueled cultural story about the mentally ill. There's an abysmal lack of evidence-based qualitative research, and especially perhaps about the role of peer support. And lastly, among the recovery movement, there's still a somewhat fragmented view and it's very easy to divide and conquer. And it's within this context that this research took place. Before I begin to describe the research, I need to declare the position I held when I began. My interest in the nature of mental illness really goes back all my life. My parents were both doctors and won many prizes and published many books going back to 1948, and the last one was in 1994. My problem with the biological explanation began when I became mentally ill, and this lens became a part of my own lived experience. One of the effects was that it created a chasm of communication that neither I nor my parents could breach. And it confirmed us in a form of mutual alienation. Later, when my wife Fran suffered a post-puerperal psychosis and later was diagnosed with schizoaffective disorder and then schizophrenia and finally bipolar, the inadequacies of the medical approach helped turn and keep life as a living nightmare for both of us. We both recovered mainly through the peer support given by GROW. GROW helped both of us to find niches of peer support when we were ready, that already existed in the community and where we were able to thrive. Recovery has been described as a journey rather than as an outcome for both Fran and myself, and I think this is really critical to the whole argument. A critical outcome was that we ceased the need for medication and professional help. My own recovery included study, doing psychology, family therapy, and most recently a PhD. Another highly significant event was being part of the first Mental Health Commission and being introduced to a much wider and international conversation about recovery. The research I undertook was a narrative study whose aim was to explore the recovery experiences of a cohort of GROW leaders, to see how various types of help facilitated, aided, or impeded recovery, and the role peer support or mutual relationships such as friendship, reciprocity, and leadership played in recovery. Before telling you about the findings, I'll say a little bit about GROW. GROW began in Australia in 1957 and came to Ireland in 1969. It's Ireland's largest mutual help organisation in the area of mental health. The key person was Con Keogh, who had PhDs in divinity and philosophy before being diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia. As and after he recovered, Con became GROW's epistemologist, carefully shaping both the philosophy and practice. GROW works by providing a 12-step program which leads out of mental illness. It's perhaps particularly suited to narrative research because it's firmly rooted in a narrative tradition. As a GROW member, you're encouraged to tell your story in different ways. Myself as someone who's experienced mental illness, someone who has knowledge of recovery, someone who discovers leadership skills, and somebody who has a management role within the organisation. There are many defining features of GROW that are worth mentioning. Firstly, it's a psychology of mental health, not mental illness. Secondly, it places responsibility for recovery on the individual. It states quite categorically in its manifesto that the most important helpers in recovery are other friendly human beings who know from experience how to recover, and all other helpers, including doctors, are necessarily subordinate. They're good in their place, but harmful when they don't make way for self-activation through peer support. GROW also equates mental illness with other aspects of the human condition, such as goodness and badness, sexual normality or deviance, and suggests that rather than dividing society into different groups, mental health, mental illness goes down the heart of each one of us. Lastly, it believes that people become mentally ill through learned habits of thinking and acting, habits which can be unlearned. My research was a narrative study in which people told me their stories of recovery from mental illness through peer support. All the people involved had to fulfill the following inclusion criteria. They must have been diagnosed with a mental illness and treated with either medication or hospital or both. They had to be in GROW for 3 years, have been involved in leadership, and consider themselves to be recovered. Recruitment was incredibly easy. No sooner did I put out a request through fieldworkers, posters, and an article that I began receiving notices of interest. Just to give you some idea of the profile of this group of articulate and extremely generous people, they ranged in age from mid-30s to the mid-70s. They were roughly equally split between men and women, and they came from all over Ireland. Just under half had been diagnosed with lifelong conditions such as schizophrenia and bipolar. Other diagnoses included chronic depression, personality disorder, anorexia nervosa, and acute anxiety. 16 of the group had been hospitalised between 1 and 10 times, and all had been prescribed medication. At the time of interview, only 10 of the 26 were still on reduced levels of medication, and only 4 of the 10 who had received a lifelong diagnosis were still on medication. All had regularly led GROW meetings, and 25 had taken on more formal leadership roles. I can't find the words to adequately describe how warm and willing each person was. They spoke disarmingly frankly about many taboo subjects. Many had experienced years and years of trauma, and some had been hospitalised many, many times. Interviews were carried out in their homes, in GROW offices, and in one case a hotel. Each person was extremely generous and giving me a wonderful depth and richness of experience, and I was often deeply humbled and almost overwhelmed by the frankness of their storytelling and by their trust in me as a researcher. Before I started recruitment, I had to get ethical approval, and in my application I argued that people who'd recovered from mental illness should no longer be regarded as any more vulnerable than the rest of the population. I was told that not only must I tick the box for vulnerability, but I must also tick the box saying they were mentally ill. Proof, if proof were needed, that the dominant thinking about recovery in the Faculty of Health Science Ethics Committee in Trinity, if you were once mentally ill, you remain mentally ill. After interviewing each person and having the interviews transcribed, I underwent a period of intense immersion in their content. I began analysing the findings. A multitude of themes began to emerge, and many of these spoke about different levels of being. I developed simple colour-coded tables that attempted to explore relationships between the different levels, seeking relationships between feelings and thoughts and belief, behaviour, to a widening network of relationships with family, peers, and authoritative others. It took many weeks and many hours, sifting backwards and forwards, making tables, drawing maps, listening to the taped accounts, and rereading each script, and going for long, reflective walks. The stories began to fit into a natural sequence before, during, and after GROW. It was almost at the very end, when I'd written up the findings, that the overall theme of recovery as a re-enchantment suggested itself. And the word re-enchantment is a word I really love. At the beginning of the study, I'd been fascinated that Max Weber had said the trouble with science is that it tends to rob life of enchantment. The word re-enchantment, initiated through involvement in peer support, really caught the essence of what I'd been told. It took place in 3 distinct but non-linear phases. From people's accounts, which meandered backwards and forwards across time, a picture emerged showing how each person had first of all progressively become trapped in a place of terror. Recovery, which started by joining GROW, was described as a time of healing, and it was further reinforced by rejoining society, which was now experienced as an opportunity to become. The overwhelming word that people used as they described their journeys into mental illness was the word terror, and it was a word spoken at many different levels. Terrifying feelings, thoughts, beliefs, terrifying situations, memories, relationships, terrifying possibilities, terrifying behaviour, and a terrifying lack of care. I was terrified to ask. I was terrified of being given ECT. When he raped me, I felt dreadful. I used to imagine the children lying dead in a ditch. I started to cut myself. I was abandoned at 18. I was out of control. People's descriptions of what I call the embodiment of terror revealed a toxic cocktail of unruly negative emotions, serving to obscure all other forms of reality. Richard described it. He said, I had this wild sense of upset and loss. Nan had a feeling of gloom. Danny felt I couldn't go on. And James was absolutely at his wit's end. And Francis had lost a sense of who she was. Over time, these feelings, which were originally valid responses to events, festered and began to alienate and isolate the person. The body stories grew and grew like an unlanced boil, and feelings of terror seemed to attract a range of other destructive feelings, such as hatred, rage, despair, rejection, and resentment. It was almost like peer support among negative feelings. Charlie said I should have had rage printed across my forehead. And Jess, I was so full of hatred. Peter, I was full of self-hatred and experienced others as negative. Rejection was big for Francis. And I resented them, said Helen. It was as though within each physical body, the negative emotional story of terror attracted other stories, and they all began to shout. And as they did, pressure mounted and mounted, and there was nobody to tell, no one to provide love or reassurance. And then these emotions were interpreted by others. In Claire's case, they were so intense after the loss of her son and grandson through suicide. I was hospitalised with a heart attack, a suspected heart attack, but it was only grief. Many others were diagnosed with schizophrenia or bipolar. It was as though two languages, the language of emotion and the language of diagnosis, were passing by each other with no connection. The stories clearly revealed multiple sources of terror that came from a widening range of relationships. The first of these was the relationship between feelings of terror and thoughts and beliefs. Matthew was taken out of a river, not because he was trying to take his life, but he thought he'd lost my soul and the only way to get it back was to drown. Paul reported, I was totally paranoid about my friend and I believed he was plotting to kill me. Danny linked his thoughts to the behaviour of others and revealed another common theme, a breach of trust. I was sexually abused and it made it so I couldn't trust people. Vicky built on this. I knew something was wrong, but I felt powerless. The stories were peppered with descriptions of very real and very traumatic life experiences which would evoke feelings of terror or disgust in anybody. Rape, childhood abuse, constant ridicule, bullying by peers and teachers, bereavement, poverty. I was abused by a trusted neighbour from the age of 2. Friends were never allowed to visit. One of the teachers was a bully. He should have been arrested. I couldn't please my teachers. I couldn't please my parents. I came to think I was a bad person. What all of these testimonies had in common was the fact there was nobody to tell, no one there to help relieve the pressure, no resources waiting in the wings. People had no access to and had been effectively cut off from all other realities, especially the reality of love. The final theme to emerge from a place of terror was an overwhelming desire to escape, and the commonest strategy was to isolate. And it didn't work. My world just got smaller and smaller, said Nan. I wanted to die to escape the pain. I got to the stage where I didn't want to go to work, and I loved work. Others spoke about seeking relief through alcohol or illegal drugs, strategies which only made things worse. And finally, people sought professional help, and many found that instead of an escape, their experiences only added to the sense of terror. Perhaps the most striking feature of these descriptions was the impersonal way in which people were treated. It was almost as though they weren't there. They're really only concerned with symptoms, said Matthew. He wasn't looking at my face, just writing. The longest conversation I had with any professional was 10 minutes in 20 years. Extraordinary, isn't it? Said David. Peter reported how the media amplified the view of psychiatry, that people with mental illness are different, have different brains. My psychiatrist appeared on television. He maintained people like me have different brain structures. He was a cold fish. Tom described how, as a young man, all his hopes were dashed by an interview with a psychiatrist. And he sort of looked very gloomily at me and he said, well, you'll be on medication for life. I don't think you'll ever hold down full-time work. Friendships may be difficult. You'll never drive, never have a house of your own, and never have relationships. Being given a serious diagnosis, or in fact being given any diagnosis, was often described as being like receiving a life sentence. As we progress to the next stage of recovery, it becomes apparent that spiritual body stories such as hope are crucial to recovery. Here, hope drained away, opening a terrifying chasm of an empty, dependent, loveless, meaningless future. Hospital too could fuel a sense of terror, It was horrible. It was depressing, said Penny. A very psychotic man would come up and pretend to shoot me, said Matthew. It was a big stigma. This is me locked up. Nobody talked to me, said David. Finally, medication could be a nightmare. The tablets made me vomit. My legs turned to jelly. It felt like my brain would explode. It dawned on me I needed more tablets to get the same kick. As a result of discovering all these levels of story about the genesis of terror, I created an ontological model or mind map consisting of widening concentric circles around a human spirit which lived within a series of physical, mental, social and cultural bodies, all of which were involved in the genesis and maintenance of terror. And I used this diagram to map out different individuals' singular experiences of terror. Recovery began when people joined GROW or became involved in peer support, and I'm fairly certain that the results in GROW would be equally true for another mutual help organisation. A major breakthrough in understanding the processes involved happened when Matthew, who was hospitalised 10 times, stated in his interview that recovery began when I moved from my small self to a bigger self. This profound but oh so simple statement really blew me away. In other words, he moved from his small, isolated physical world, a world dominated by his own feelings and imagination, to a warm, nurturing social body, a body which became a bigger self, a second social mind, a nurturing community, a body which revealed a new and enchanting reality about himself. He began to experience himself differently through ongoing participation in peer support. Many people describe profound and immediate effects at their very first meeting of GROW. It instantly awoke a new and insistently attractive range of body stories, far more powerful and meaningful than the effects of any drug. That night going home, I felt I'd been lifted, said Mags. I felt so comfortable inside that room, said Jess. There were all these smiling faces looking at me. From the get-go, I connected. As I continued to analyse reports of a time of healing, many of the same processes that had progressively brought people into a place of terror began to reappear. But now they were in reverse. Now they began to liberate and heal, and many of Mikhail Bakhtin's ideas began to make sense. Joining GROW often involved an intense struggle to attend. For 6 months I'd sit in the car. I only went along because perhaps GROW offered a way out, and I felt I had nowhere else to go. The struggle to attend represented to me what Bakhtin calls a struggle to overcome alien voices, in this case the fear of others or an ability to trust other people, and it introduced each person to a positive and ongoing dialogue with others within the safe body of peer support. Nearly everybody described the link between a warm emotional welcome and the genesis of hope. This fitted Bakhtin's idea of what he calls appropriation and ventriloquation. The minute I walked in the door, there was a feeling of warmth, a feeling of not being alone. It was a warmth, it was a smile. I felt I got hope, and hope had never occurred to me before. You can't go into a supermarket and buy hope. Newcomers to GROW appropriated a range of new body stories through a warmth and a smile, which were deeply and meaningfully felt and which began to give rise to other positive feelings and then to liberating new thoughts. What I find intriguing is that what these stories describe is the opposite of what happens when you seek help. Usually you're given a tablet, which is a form of external control. Here you're offered warm, welcome inclusion in a community, and because of this, healing processes are awoken from the inside. Hopeful feelings began to give birth to new thoughts, which in turn began to direct behaviour. I think that's the very first step, hoping I can get well and stay well. I felt, I'll go next week, and I wasn't even capable of thinking that far ahead, said Mags. Francis used the word resonance. Someone can say something, you listen, and it's gone. When it resonates, it not only stays, but it does some kind of transformation as well. It can be physical or emotional. And people didn't only tell stories through words. They spoke through their actions, smiles, touches, reliability, friendliness. Participation in peer support began to provide a new, affirmed and affirming identity. As Francis put it, I had no sense of myself. I didn't know who I was. I had very strong hang-ups about being illegitimate. I'd learnt lots of lessons from neighbours, from my own family, children in school, that I was different, I was less. She continued, I went to my first meeting and a person gave her testimony. It was about being adopted. I was looking at her, and because I thought she was telling my story, that night I said, God, why have I carried this? I went home 10 feet taller. Many accounts hinted at the possibility of providence being involved in recovery. What are the odds of such an encounter? Sue beautifully described being immersed in a new and enacted story that proclaimed her value and lovability. She grew into a new name, given through both words and action. I felt when people got to know me, they wouldn't like me. And when I first joined Grow, Liz used to call me my lovely Sue. She used to give me a great big hug at the end of the meeting. The image that emerged from collective accounts was of the group acting as a kind of womb, which fed all the different emerging cells with spiritual nutrients such as warmth, encouragement, the spirit of friendliness, hope and empowerment. Peter put it this way, there's something mystical about a good Grow group. You reach each other at a level of deeper understanding and a sense of shared humanity. You get a sense there is a spiritual presence. It was through ongoing participation in the reciprocal relationships of peer support, such as friendship and leadership, that each person became the subject of, an observer of, a real drama being played out around them and through them, and of which they were a part. As well as receiving friendship and being led, each person was expected and challenged to become a friend and to lead. A carnival atmosphere existed where the dominant voices of society and biomedical psychiatry could be put aside. Through an ongoing dialogue of challenge and support, and through the shared witness of stories, and by an increasing involvement outside the activities of the womb of the weekly meeting, people began to realise new possibilities and re-author a new identity. Each person began to take responsibility for their own behaviour. People began to move out from the group and take part in a much wider Grow community. If I felt down and if I rang B would be here in 5 minutes and wouldn't bring me back till 10, and I'd come back laughing. I went on a weekend, said Pat, and I was blown away. A theme that began to emerge, and one that places recovery firmly within the language of values, ethics, philosophy and theology, was the power of goodness. English psychiatrist Phil Thomas has described scientific models of mental illness, such as the biomedical model, as examples of moral failure. Miranda Fricker suggests they're a form of interpretive injustice. In their accounts of recovery, people constantly use the word good, seeing good in themselves, doing the ordinary and good thing in spite of their feelings of fear or repulsion, finding friendship and community good. All serve to slowly reveal a new kind of identity, one based on personal value and meaning and hope for the future. The theme of goodness firmly suggests that there are very real links between mental health and right habits of thinking, behaviour and relationships. Richard said, doing the ordinary good thing became my theology. David said, I don't believe in God, but I do believe in good in the sense of Aristotle's ethical living. And Nan said, feeling good about yourself is a wonderful positive energy. While professional help has been shown as capable of generating additional terror, many stories highlighted its positive value and potential. 3 themes emerged: hospital as sanctuary, healing professional relationships, and the benefits of medication. Within these themes, what shone through was the power of relationship and ordinary good human qualities such as sharing, interest, kindness, meaning, and warmth. When the doctor said I should spend time in hospital, I was absolutely delighted. Even when the nurses were off duty, they asked for me, and it made me feel great, said Tom. Medication got my sleep back. Matthew described an incident when nurses bent the rules and acted as human tranquilizers, or ordinary human peers. I was suicidal, and a very kind nurse brought me into the nurse's office. They got me a cup of tea. I felt better after 10 minutes talking. It took me out of that place, which was great, you know. Finally, Mags revealed how a young doctor challenged her to take risks and begin to follow her dreams. This appears to fly in the face of a system that's afraid to take risks. She said, "Where have you ever dreamed of going?" And I said, "America." And when I came back, I knew I was kind of recovered, and I began to reduce the medication. Here we had two young women in dialogue talking about something ordinary and awakening recovery. Very similar processes of change were revealed in the third part of recovery, when people became re-involved in society. Once again, they were all shown to involve the relationship between different levels of being. If recovery began, as Matthew suggested, when I left my small physical self and joined a bigger social self, it was enhanced when people left the relatively small self of grow and found they could now successfully cope with the challenges of the big bad self of society. Society had now become an opportunity to become. The first theme showed that people had become empowered to make choices. Involvement in peer support had acted as a rehearsal ground, increasingly allowing and preparing people to take risks and make legitimate choices and take legitimate risks. And now this process was extended to becoming involved in what Rappaport has called pre-existent niches in society, niches where people would feel at home and where their ongoing needs would be met and their talents could continue to develop. Peter and Kathy spelt it out. Recovery is like a stool. It needs more than two legs. "You're sent out," said Kathy. "I don't think someone can become if you keep together. If you're sent out to build your own social network, you're not stigmatized by grow." While choice at first involved overcoming the alien fear or revulsion, the alien voice of fear or revulsion, increasingly people found a desire to become, to fight for their identity. "I began to sense I needed a challenge," said Kathy. "I sensed that even though work was pushing me beyond my limits, it was good for me." They immediately began to be rewarded by positive internal stories which affected the way they felt and thought and interacted in society. "I started to relax and people started to get more friendly," said Tom. "I was able to go out and mix and do different things. I volunteered for a leadership role." 3 types of social involvement were described: work, education and leisure. Kate told of the enormous value of work and receiving payment. Being part of a workforce conferred in a very tangible way a new identity. It also provided her with another form of peer support. Having a disposable income allowed her to move from a part of town that was full of alien voices of deprivation, and therefore to be able to relax about her children. One of the biggest things was returning to work. I had gathered the courage to say, "I can do this. Indeed, I have to do this." It was the first step onto the beginning of a new life. It enabled us to buy our first house away from an area that had become notorious for crime and drugs. Peer support through leisure involvement revealed hidden agendas which together could be summarized as proof that I am the same as other people, not the alien voice of difference. For James, golf became a means of gaining control of the alien voice of unruly emotions. I noticed my anger levels would build up. The more my anger would build up, the more I felt people were out to get me. Some people will get the clubs and throw them into the hedges, and I can say that was me a year ago. A really surprising number of people, about 2/3, reported the benefits of studying theology or philosophy. I discovered philosophy. I get a kick out of it. I learned through theology that Christianity is very practical. I saw a common thread between Christian mystics, Taoism and Zen. Kathy used the phrase, "I think I loved it," suggesting that her involvement set up a spring of positive emotion that gave rise to personal life. It was wonderful to sit in the class. I think I loved it. Participants spoke of a growing ability to re-author their past and of a growing sense of becoming mature. I suppose for me it's learning maturity as an adult, that it was okay to disagree. I developed the ability to form friendships and how to deal with people even when they were difficult. Mountains slowly became molehills and life became manageable. They also spoke of a desire to make use of their experiences of the past and become part of the social good. It made me that strong, I thought, what can I do about suicide? My sufferings humbled me. I'd like to feel that somehow I'd be able to pay people back. This would seem to be a significant finding, representing a pool of willing leadership waiting to be tapped. The very first theme to emerge from this study, and one which I tried to put aside was providence, and yet it was mentioned so often it has to be included. It was as though life itself, or goodness, was only too willing to provide whatever was needed once people set out along the recovery road. Things happen that are beyond explaining, said Peg. Providence features greatly in my life. If you only get involved, you meet people, and the net widens. To summarise, the emergent story of recovery from mental illness as a re-enchantment with life is a story that takes place in 3 distinct but non-linear phases. Over time, people become trapped in a place of terror through the generation and non-resolution of a range of emotional, cognitive and social events occurring at many levels. They experience a lack of human support. A time of healing begins and is nurtured through ongoing involvement in peer support. Healing is further strengthened when people become re-involved in society, which now provides them with an opportunity to become. What is really exciting to me is that these collective accounts reveal very real and very observable ontological processes. Just as in medicine, it's easy to see the role biological processes play in the generation of illness or recovery. Through listening to the people I interviewed, I was able to see little stories which brought health and stories which created terror. I want to end by presenting an image of the human being based on the findings of this research. I've called it a word made flesh, or an existential pencil. Price suggests that the greatest challenge in psychology isn't about cause of mental illness, but about creating models of the human being that allow us to explore the relationships between many different levels of cause. This model represents each individual as they develop through time. It can therefore be used to explore with the person any event in their life, be it social, cultural, cognitive, or emotional. It represents the human being as always becoming, as always reaching into the future. The human being is revealed as a spiritual being, living within a series of bodies. The closest of these is our physical body, then our mind, then our relationships, which are in effect a social body and a social mind. These are constantly creating stories which challenge and affect our spirit. Each person constantly tries to write their own story, and the quality of that story depends on their developing character, but also on the life situation in which they find themselves at any particular moment. Healing begins when the spirit is nurtured through ongoing dialogue with friendly human peers and through the pursuit of goodness and community. Aristotle put it this way: our friends make us good. Our unique and individual humanity is revealed through our storytelling with others, and as we grow in the ability to overcome alien stories being told about us. What's very clear is the pivotal role played by peer support. The research provides many challenges for the mental health system. It highlights the key role of peer support, the key role of community integration, the importance of acknowledging the value of lived experience, to move from a risk-averse culture and narratives that create despair, the need for alternatives to medication and proactive opportunities for people to come off medication, and for further narrative research, and for a change in the role of professionals. I'd like to thank all the people who took part in the study, and especially Trinity School of Nursing and Midwifery, and I would sincerely suggest anyone who's thinking of doing research, it is a great place to do it. There's tremendous support. I'd like to thank my supervisor Agnes, who's in bed with flu. As a society, we have a choice. We can choose to explore and work together to create a mental health system that creates and explores narratives of hope, narratives of mental illness, and reduce their lives to a biochemical level and to lives of dependence and despair. I believe the stories that were gathered to make up this research make a valid argument for more qualitative research, so that together as human beings with access to different kinds of knowledge, we can redress some of the damage being done by the present system. I also believe that through involving more and more existing niches within society, our mental health system can slowly create a net that will be able to catch any of us who falls and to offer recovery in the form of friendly help. Once again, many thanks to the people who informed the study, and to everybody for listening. Thank you.
I'd like on your behalf to thank Mike for that really thought-provoking, very sensitive presentation, which will give us all a lot of food for thought. And Mike, you will take some questions from the audience.
Sure,
so anyone who wishes to ask a question, Jenny has the microphone, and if you might just identify yourself so as we know where you're from, if you want to. If you don't want to, that's fine. So, and Louise will handle the question.
So again, Mike, thank you very much. So we have about 10 minutes or so for questions or comments, and I'll throw it open to the floor, and Jenny can go to you with the microphone. So the first row here. Thanks, Jenny.
There's a couple of things there. I mean, everybody's different, but my wife Fran, I had my own problems. Fran's was psychotic for months at a time. She was given so much Largactil, they said it would put an elephant to sleep. It had no effect. No effect. It was a nightmare. But very, very slowly over time, she worked her way through it. There was no support at all, and Con was persuaded to join AA, and he liked he liked the community and sense of camaraderie and the idea of steps, and then they got permission from AA to adapt the steps. So that's how it evolved. No, they're very different, and we don't talk about being a recovered person. You definitely recover. There's one part of the program, how do you know you've recovered? So, we do recover as far as anybody can recover. Oh, absolutely, yeah. I mean, it's good if a lot of people, that was, if there was more time you could mention everything. That was another thing of the healing professional, the person who encouraged people to go to grow and took an interest. And in Grow you get a task every week to do something, so you begin to get an idea of progress being made, and if your doctor takes an interest at that level as well, it can be extremely helpful. We get 1.3 million a year, and we have 130 groups, and we employ something like 30 part-time field workers. But in 1987, the World Health Organization said that given the right support, Grow had the same potential as AA. Now, Limerick is very strong. We have about 5 groups in Limerick. There are 165 AA groups in Limerick a week. So it'll show you the potential for mutual help. And what I'm going to try and do is get figures as well, the whole budget for mental health, how much is spent on psychiatrists, psychologists, nurses, OTs, medication, and what proportion goes to mutual help. And I'd say it's an absolute fraction. And yet, mutual help, if you want to get people better, that is the key, I believe, anyway. No, I think there are people in Grow who've been incredibly sick. There's an international Grow, and all the founder members were people who were diagnosed with schizophrenia. And one of the key international leaders is a woman called Joni. And when she first came to joined Grow, she could only stay for about 15 minutes. That's all she could handle, and then she'd leave, and people would go out and sit with her on the step, and very, very gradually she began to, be wooed in, I suppose, and so. actually the Rappaport did research, and he found there were 5 bands of people who came in, and the most readily available leadership was from people who had life problems, but they had plenty of resources and they weren't too sick. But he said the most valuable leadership emerged when people stayed for years, and the people who'd really been diagnosed, written off with schizophrenia, people who'd been really sick for years, they came through as the most valuable leaders. And there's another really interesting study done in South Africa, which has nothing to do with GROW, but it's about peer support, where they asked for the most neglected patients from all the psychiatric hospitals in South Africa, and they formed a team with staff, and they really befriended them. And within about 2 years, they had most of those people who they were totally incontinent. They couldn't even, they'd just given up on everything, looking after themselves in every way, and they came back and got back into life. So I think it's so exciting, and there's so much potential that you know, the way we just throw drugs at everything, it break your heart.
Mike, I'd like to really just bow to you in respect for this work. It's really fantastic, and I think it must have taken, and it did take, enormous courage and patience to just get to where you've got to. And I've been around a long time, so I know how rare it is and how rare it was for me to hear talks like this. And you know, the depth of what you've shared with us is completely a reflection of the depth of your listening and your openness and your respect and your willingness to let those people touch you. And that's what's missing. You know, it just doesn't happen. They're all nuts, and they just need to be kept at arm's length. And as you say, we're much more concerned with risk and very, very frightened of an encounter that might feel human. It's extraordinary. But I will take away with me a couple of things, but particularly a phrase about the language of emotion passing the language of diagnosis and like ships in the night, you know. I'll take away with you, you know, the needing to change the narrative of despair, which is what we're locked in right now about suicide and mental health, the whole thing. It just gets, it sounds positive, but it, to me, reeks of despair, actually, about the whole thing. I'm moving to, you know, a narrative of hope. And just, there was something else that really struck me, and already I've forgotten it. This is what happens. Anyway, we won't go there. Look, thank you, Mike, and just really
thanks very much.
What you've done.
Thank you. Sorry. I was lucky. I was really lucky that I was left money. I was left money in the height of my madness, if you like. And I bought a farm, and I sold the farm to pay to go to college, and I had 3 small kids, and we managed. But I often wonder, I think there definitely should be grants available, and I think people should be encouraged and given every assistance. And certainly, I'd just like to say that I think that there's a huge support there if you have a mental health vulnerability, or people think you have. In academic life, there seems to be a tremendous kind of warmth. Certainly in this school there was. I really felt that almost the same experience of going to GROW, of being welcomed by everybody in this place. And I did when I did my primary degree in Galway. And so I really agree with that. I think there should be grants for people to go, especially as you know, people who are well on the road to recovery and can deal with because there's quite a lot of pressures in study too. Yeah.
Okay, well,
Thanks
thank you very much. And again, Mike, thank you so much for your
Thank
really
you.
powerful and very hopeful comments.